Ladies and gents, it's a pleasure to be in Vancouver. My last time here was more than half a lifetime ago, about 30 years ago. There are a few tiny little changes that I notice around town since then. It's a wonderful place. I'm going to be, you can read probably faster than I can talk, and I've got lots and lots of slides, but I promise you I will not inflict death by PowerPoint on you over the next 50 minutes or so. I'm going to be talking about more or less the economics of population growth, or the population explosion, maybe, as we can think of it. I'm going to be talking about its impact on living standards and economic circumstances for human beings. There's an awful lot of stuff I'm not going to be talking about, and I'm sure that some of these things, very, very important things, I'm not going to be talking about with respect to the population explosion. Simply on the question of human living standards, human productivity, and those things that define our sort of little microeconomic environment as people. Of course, the most influential argument that we have heard over the last several hundred years about population growth and economics was offered by Thomas Malthus in 1798 in his little treatise. And it was a very pessimistic, very worried look at the possible relationship between human population growth and living standards. And to oversimplify his argument a little bit, he said it was a trade-off, that population growth would tend to increase more rapidly than the resources available for sustaining living standards, and that this would lead to a kind of a grim equilibrium that would be caused by a decline in living standards, rises in death, and so forth and so on, until an equilibrium was reintroduced. And if you look at what has happened in the past several decades, and then in the past several hundred years, you have to wonder whether Malthus is looking over our shoulders. We're all children of the population explosion. We all live in the period of time in human history when human numbers have increased at the most rapid pace that ever has been recorded and perhaps ever has occurred. It's not just the post-war increase in total human numbers. This graphic makes it look kind of gradual and nice and slow. I can show you one that'll make it look, shockingly fast, which is probably more accurate. Take a look at this. This is an estimate of what total human numbers looked like from the beginning of our common era, or from the birth of Christ, to today. And you'll notice that this is a logarithmic chart. You see, we go from 100 to 1,000 to 10,000 millions of people. Now, if we were just increasing geometrically, if we were just increasing exponentially, like compound interest, it would be a straight line on this chart. But you see that there's a curve within a curve here. So we've been increasing at more than exponential pace over this last period of time. And so we're up beyond 7 billion, heading, I don't think anybody really knows where. And as human numbers have made this extraordinary surge, we've also seen things which might look to those who follow economic questions like kind of big flashing warning signs on our dashboard. If you look at mouths and food, mouths and food. If you look at the actual price of foodstuffs traded internationally, the actual price, the paid price of foodstuffs has increased by a factor of about 10 since 1900. And it's true for maize, or as we call it in Washington, D.C., for corn. It's true for wheat. It's true for rice. It's true for all of the basic things which we need for human sustenance. So if you looked at just those series of charts I've just showed you so far, you'd say, well, we're doomed. You can go home, curl up into, fetal position, and you don't need to come back to the next lecture. It's not quite like that. And I'm going to show you why there is, I think, some reason for cautious optimism on the economic side. I think the progress that has been made economically during this extraordinary surge of human numbers is actually a little bit better than many of us think. It's not to minimize the human problems that we live with today, but if you look at some of these trends, there are interesting things that have been happening in our human economy. And what makes the economy kind of so interesting is it's operated by human beings, and human beings are kind of interesting. Let me start with one thing that I always found kind of curious when I was starting to do my own homework on population economics and stuff. It was about 40 years ago as an undergraduate at Harvard. I was never able to everybody knows what overpopulation is. If you talk to, I think, almost anybody, almost everybody knows what it is. And they don't all mean the same thing, though, when you ask them what it is. You add these all up and you get different answers for what overpopulation is. Here's a little problem from an economic standpoint. It is, I think, as a practical matter, impossible to come up with a universally acceptable and unambiguous definition of overpopulation using demographic metrics alone. You can't describe overpopulation with demographic criterion, just using demographic criterion to describe it. And say population density. I mean, that's one that I always thought sounded like kind of a good way of talking about overpopulation. If you look at a country like Bangladesh, which is very, very densely populated country, this criterion of population density might sound good. But then if you went to a place like Belgium, which is also very densely populated, people don't usually talk about overpopulation in Belgium, and they don't always talk about overpopulation in Singapore, which is much more densely populated than either of those places. And the most densely populated place in the world is the Principality of Monaco, and I've not read many treatises on overpopulation in Monaco. You can go through and do the same sort of a drill with other sorts of, seemingly plausible metrics. Say, rapid population growth. We see rapid population growth in sub-Saharan Africa today. That might be a good definition for overpopulation. But of course, Canada's pace of population growth in the 19th century and even well into the 20th century at different periods was higher than sub-Saharan Africa's today. Canada wasn't a poster child for overpopulation back in the 1850s, for example. And you can go through and find that I think what we're really talking about when we have these images of overpopulation, these teeming slums and hungry people and disease-afflicted children, I think what we're really talking about is poverty. We're talking about desperate poverty or severe poverty afflicting human beings. And what I'm going to try to show you in the next little while is that the correspondence between population change and human poverty is there, but it's more complicated and it's a little bit more unpredictable than we might think. So, so you see that this is you don't really learn anything about a country's income level if you only know its population density, and the same is true with its availability of arable land. Actually, there's a tiny association between increasing wealth and decreasing availability of arable land. It's not very significant, but you can see it's like that. Now here's remember I showed you what was happening with prices of rice, corn, and wheat over the 20th century and on to today. Those prices that I showed you were not adjusted for inflation. They were just the nominal prices. And of course, as the value of money around the world has kind of decreased over time in Canada and the United States, as well as in other places, probably better to get a sense of what the inflation-adjusted prices of these life-sustaining resources are. So what I used here in trying to give a second take on this is the United States Producer Price Index. It's a deflator that we use for goods rather than for services, for commodities usually. And I'm not being as USA-ocentric as that might seem, because an awful lot of, by convention, an awful lot of the commodities that I'm describing here are traded in international markets in denomination of US dollars. So you want to deflate a US dollar with a US dollar deflator. So that's why I did it this way. So what happens when we use a deflator and we take inflation into account? Well, we have a very different trajectory for the price of the major cereal grains, the major food grains, than we did in those first three slides. The first three slides are going up like that. These are going down. I mean, to be sure, they're not going down in any sort of calm, regular pattern. We can see World War I, where they spike up. We can see World War II, where they spike up. We can see the 70s, when there was a peculiar episode called the World Food Crisis, which we could talk about later. They spike up. But the general tendency has been kind of downward. If you look at the price of rice over this 110-year period that I have up here, not just a few years, I mean a lot of years, there's a very strong downward trend in the inflation-adjusted price of rice. In fact, those of you who like scientific notation, this equation indicates that over the long haul, the price of rice tends to be, the real price of rice, inflation adjusted, tends to be falling by about 1.2% per year. And of course, if something drops by 1.2% a year for 100 years, or for 110 years, that's a lot of downward pressure. And you can see that by that kind of regression line. The price tendency has been going very, very strongly downward by, I think more than 60%, maybe almost 70% over this period. Same thing for wheat. Pattern's a little bit different, but the same idea. And you see World War I and World War II and the food crisis spiking things up. And you may be seeing a little bit of the emergence of China as a major buyer, kind of like what we're going through now. But even so, the long-term tendency has been for inflation-adjusted prices for wheat to decline by about 1% a year over this very long period of time. Same thing for corn, for maize. Long-term tendency of decline about 1.3% a year, dropping by almost 70%, the tendency over that long period of time, by about 70%. That's a lot. That's a lot of drop. If we look at a larger index of edible food commodities, of things that people buy and they eat, and then things like tea and coffee and beef, lamb, just different sorts of foodstuffs that are put together into kind of commodity indices. We see a similar pattern over time. Over this same century, since 1900, looking towards today, the overall tendency it's bounced all around, but it's been very strongly downward. And these foodstuffs have been declining in inflation-adjusted price at a tendency of about 0.7% a year. In any given year, that doesn't mean a lot. You do that for 100 years or 110 years, and you get a lot of change. So far I've just looked at foodstuffs, and made kind of an argument that the inflation-adjusted price of foodstuffs has not only been coming down, but been coming way down during this period of extraordinary human population increase. But what about other things? Well, some fellas at the World Bank back in the Stone Age, back in like 1988 or something, they made a commodity index which used, I think it was 24 different commodities. And so they used not just foodstuffs that people ate, but also agricultural products that people grow but can't eat, like cotton and things like that. And then they also put in different sorts of minerals, things like copper and tin and zinc. Conspicuously absent is fuel. They don't have energy in there. They don't have oil. They don't have gas. But they've got a whole range of other commodities. And when you look at this index that they developed, and other people have kept it going since the 80s, same sort of thing. Long-term decline in the inflation-adjusted price of overall commodities, tending downwards at a pace of about 0.7% a year for a century or more. But so the most comprehensive index that I've been able to find of inflation-adjusted commodities is run by the Economist newspaper, the Economist magazine. And they started a long time ago, and back in the 1860s, they started doing an industrial commodity price index. They've got about 30 different things that are used by industry, including foodstuffs, including agricultural products that you can't eat, including different sorts of minerals, also including processed metals. Not energy. It's also lacking here. And when you look at their index, and this is a chart that I that I borrowed right out of the Economist magazine, is one that they did. You can see what a tremendously powerful long-term downward trend there is in these real prices. Now, if we could, their chart only went up to 2005, and we're alive in 2013 or whatever we're in right now. So there's some stuff missing here. If we had those missing data points, they'd take us back up to about here, because there's been a big, despite the post-2008 crash, there's been a spike and a drop and another spike in this. But it doesn't change the essential features of very powerful long-term declines in the real prices, the inflation-adjusted prices of these natural resources that human beings use for their sustenance and for their lifestyles. Now, that's a kind of an interesting thing. It's something you don't usually hear about. And it's even more interesting when you counterpose it against the population explosion. Because this decline in real prices of commodities and things that people use was going on at a time when the human population was growing not just in scale but in tempo at something that that human beings had never ever seen before. They'd never experienced this before. That's the population side of it. But there's more, as they say on the QVC channel. It's not just the population. There's also the international economy, the global economy. The great economic historian, since passed away, Angus Maddison, dared to make estimates for 100-plus countries and for almost all of the world of GDP going back to the beginning of our common era. There was a certain amount of guesswork when you were dealing with 100 AD, or common era. Less guesswork as one gets more towards where we are now. Adjusting for inflation, Angus Maddison argued that the world's GDP, if you can call it that, increased by a factor of about 25 between 1900 and 2008, when he stopped producing this global GDP estimate. Now, remember this. What is an economy? What is a GDP? By the sorts of national accounting identities that are used in national accounts, GDP is demand. I mean, it's supply, but it's also demand. So over the course of these 108 years, over the course of this century, human economic demand on our planet increased by a factor of about 25. That's a lot of demand. So what happened to real prices when human demand was multiplying by a factor of 25? They went down. Any economist worth his or her salt will tell you that prices serve a lot of purposes. And one of the primary purposes, at least to an economist, that a price serves is to indicate scarcity, is to indicate relative scarcity. Okay? So if something's more expensive than something else, or if the price goes up, it's becoming more scarce, in economist language. We have this paradox that while human numbers were growing so extraordinarily, and while human demand upon our resources was growing in such an unprecedented manner, so-called natural resources, or natural resources that people put a financial value on, are becoming cheaper. Which is to say, in that sense, in this economist sense, they're becoming less scarce. It's a real paradox. It's a real paradox. And if you are of a Malthusian bent, it's one that's impossible to explain. You can't explain this in the Malthusian worldview. You can, however, explain it in certain sorts of economic theory. It's not so hard to explain because human beings economize, human beings innovate, and human beings can adapt in ways that can improve well-being in the face of scarcity and uncertainty. And that's the story of the 7 billion from an economic standpoint. There are a lot of tragedies within this big thing. There are a lot of individual human tragedies there. But the overall thing that we don't see is a Malthusian tragedy. That we don't see here. So, we talked about the population explosion. Let me talk for a few moments about another explosion. We'll talk about the wealth explosion. Remember, I showed you that that by Angus Maddison's estimates, the global GDP increased by about a factor of 25 between 1900 and 2008, up to the crash. Now, human numbers increased, human numbers quadrupled and a bit more over that same period of time. That means that per capita income was increasing, and increasing very dramatically over this very, very long period of time as well. And these are Angus Madison's estimates for the trajectories that we see. And I've put the world and a couple of other regions up there. I could put other ones up there if one were interested. The World Bank and the United Nations, other organizations, typically make estimates from about the year 1960 on. The virtue of Angus Madison's series is it takes us back, it takes us back further. And it's a very interesting story. So for the world as a whole, over this long period of time, the inflation-adjusted increase in per capita output, which is also demand, which is also close to being like income, more than quintupled. It increased by a factor of 5. Not from what we would think of as a very high base, but it increased by a factor of 5. Now, this increase in global prosperity was by no means evenly spread around the world, and it wasn't evenly spread within countries. We'll get to that in just a moment. But it's very powerful, and it changed a lot of things. And you can see how dramatically Latin America's overall average level increased. You can see the East Asian boom beginning more or less around 1960 and still going up, largely powered by China, but by no means only by China. You can also see sub-Saharan Africa's terrible struggles in the post-colonial period. You can see how slow sub-Saharan Africa's trend of income increase has been. But when all is said and done, despite sub-Saharan Africa's terrible problems in the last 4 decades, sub-Saharan African average income levels are several times higher than they were at the beginning of the 1900s. And that's the laggard area in the world economy today. Income obviously can be, an income average is misleading because income can be concentrated. You can have big inequalities in a country. So if we look at the wealth explosion, we might want to start at the bottom and work up instead of looking at averages and seeing how that might be misleading to us. Over the past number of years, the World Bank has come up with some estimates. They may be guesses a bit, but they call them estimates, of how many people around the world live on a budget that I think we all would see as truly desperate poverty. They used to say it was the $1 a day budget. Because of inflation, they've scaled it up to $1.25. But no one should kid themselves about the sort of level of living standard that $1.25 a day in our purchasing power would signify. It's desperate poverty. What we see by these estimates, if they are correct, is that the proportion of the developing world's population that falls below this absolutely penurious level has dropped from about 50% to a little bit over 20% over the 3 decades under consideration here. Largely, that has been driven by the success of East Asia in escaping from income poverty. You can see that downward line like that. That's largely a story about China. But you can also see that in places like South Asia, the escape from desperate poverty has been preceding not rapidly for any individual human being who's in misery, but it's been proceeding at a historically very rapid rate. Sub-Saharan Africa's struggles are highlighted in this chart. That's the laggard area there. But when one thinks of this wealth explosion, it's had an effect on mitigating desperate poverty as well, in a time of extraordinarily rapid population growth. So I should also add that with the mitigation of desperate poverty, we've seen an increase in the availability of food. These are FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization estimates. They're averages. People don't eat on the average. They either eat or they don't. But this gives you an idea of the availability of the supplies, of availability of food in foodstuffs in these areas in question. And even in in a way, what's kind of most striking to me is even in the least developed countries, what we might think of as the fourth world, below the third world, the trend has been positive, and actually in the last 2 decades, quite positive. The least developed countries are still the least developed, but the trend is heading in the right direction. And one of the reasons for this, because it turns out we've been able to produce enough food for this growing population, and it's not all being produced domestically. An awful lot of the increase in nutritional supplies for our human population, for our 7 billion plus now, has come from food that's been grown in one country and moved to another through international trade. And this chart here, the red line shows the per capita use of cereal grains that are traded internationally. The blue line shows the aggregate increase in this commodity that's been traded internationally. There was a lot of question back in the 1960s as to whether the world's food system was going to be able to respond to the demands of a global 2000 population. The future is always uncertain, but we know the answer to the question about the global 2000, at least at this point. So that's the wealth explosion. The reason that there's been a wealth explosion is in part because there's been a health explosion. And we can look at the improvement in human health, the worldwide improvement in human health, in a number of different ways. But one, I think, intuitively clear way to do so is to think about life expectancy at birth. What are your odds of, if you were born, what are your odds of living to? Over the post-war period, life expectancy for our species as a whole has jumped by about 20 years. It's increased by a little bit more than 2 decades. It has increased by more than that in the less developed areas, the places that are not OECD countries, in what we think of as more traditional Asia, Latin America, Africa, Middle East, North Africa. There are some places on Earth where the increase, the improvement in life expectancy has been, I think, piteously marginal. That includes some areas of sub-Saharan Africa that have been especially ravaged by the HIV pandemic. It also includes, strangely enough, the Russian Federation. This is another discussion, but Russia's life expectancy has been eerily stuck for the last 50 years. But those are exactly what I said. Those are exceptions. The general tendency has been for not only increasing life expectancy at birth for our species, but for dramatic increases in life expectancy. And note, by the way, we are, I think, quite rightly aware of the enormous economic gaps that separate rich and poor in our world today. But one of the most important gaps between rich and poor people has to do with their expectation of life itself. How many years of life can you expect to bequeath to a child born in your country? You'll notice from this chart, from that third row over there, that developed countries saw their life expectancies increase by 11 years, while developing countries saw theirs increase by more than twice as much as that, by 24. In this very critical way, inequality in this hardly trivial area has decreased in humanity in the post-war era. Another way of looking at the health explosion is to look at infant mortality, the odds that a baby won't survive its first year of life. I mean, it's one terrible tragedy in itself, and a tragedy for parents and family and communities. Infant mortality has fallen quite radically all across the world. There's an awful lot of room for improvement still, but the tendency, the progress that has been made shouldn't be gainsaid here. Now, in addition to this global transformation of survival prospects, we've also seen something else happen, which I think is quite interesting. With the rise in life expectancy, health inequality has diminished in a very important way. I alluded to that already, and I'll try to show you here. I used this chart here because these are data that I could, reliable data I could get my hands on. It's for Sweden. The Swedes, kept their demographic accounts back to the 1700s, and so they're always a victim for these sorts of exercises. So what this chart does is it says, out of 100,000 guys, how many died at different years, different ages, different ages of death. And you'll see that in the blue chart, the blue squiggles, which is what Sweden looked like in 1861 when its life expectancy was 45, which is about as low as any country in the world today. An extraordinary proportion of Swedish males died in their first year of life or their second year of life. That was the top age group for people to die in Sweden back then. Today, there's almost no death in the first year of life or the second year of life in Sweden, or in the 1990s. It's even more so today. This is at a time when Sweden's life expectancy for men was about 77 years, which is about the same as the USA today, which is why I chose it back home. The, I guess what statisticians would call the modal death year was 83. More people died at age 83 than any other given age in Sweden. And you notice how the distribution is changing there? The distribution is becoming much narrower, much less unequal. People are coming together in this sort of a way. And you can show it with something called the Gini Coefficient, which is a measure usually used for income inequality, but it can be used for other things too. And what you see is that the inequality in age at death is much higher when you have a low life expectancy than when you have a high life expectancy. And I used countries around the world in the post-war period to make this point. You can see that the higher the life expectancy at birth, the lower the inequality in the age at death. And I put in two kind of like notional markers there for what we think the life expectancy for our species was in 1900 and what we think it was more or less in the year 2000. So in addition to this incredible increase, this extraordinary increase in life expectancy, there's also been a substantial evening of survival chances by this measure. And, you know, in addition to being a nice thing, in addition to the fact that most people would prefer to live longer rather than shorter lives if they had a choice over it, there are consequences to this. And one of the consequences is that improved health seems to have a very positive impact on productive potential. There are lots of reasons that that could be so. The relationship between health and wealth is a lot more complicated than this little diagram might suggest, but clearly improvements in health have been part of the tapestry of the 20th century that have helped to make for the economic transformation I've alluded to before. So that's this chart is kind of hopeless. Don't, you know, just trust me when I tell you what's on here. I mean, I'll leave it behind so you can see that I'm, you know, not fooling you. In addition to, and quite related to, the explosion of health that our species has experienced, there's also been an explosion of education, or at least of years of education, years of schooling for human beings on our planet. This is one very exacting set of estimates of how much schooling adults around the world, or in countries accounting for about 93% of the human population around the world, have had. Suffice it to say, a lot more than they did 50 years ago. Suffice it also to say that the gap between men and women has been narrowing almost everywhere. I'll try to show you a little bit, maybe a little more digestible. This graphic here is done by some people at the Vienna Institute of Demography and another center in Austria. And what it shows is a global population pyramid in 1970. Total numbers of adults 15 and over. The red central tendency is men and women who had no education at all. Then the greenish, the kind of like the sickening green color there, is primary school only. Then the light blue is secondary school, and the darker blue is higher education. From a education profile standpoint, that's what 1970 looked like. So this is 2010. Okay, you can see a lot more people, not a lot more uneducated adults. A whole lot more people with all of the growth has been in people with secondary education or higher education for our species as a whole. I mean, there's, see that to that. Another way of looking at it is this. This is looking at adults 15 and over for the world as a whole, going back to the previous estimates. For the world as a whole, adults, about 50% of them had no schooling in 1950. That's down to a little bit over 10% now. I mean, we still have our job to do in eliminating illiteracy. It's not done yet. But you can see how the educational profile of our species has changed. And here's another thing. Remember I showed you the Gini coefficients, the inequality measures for age at death. The Gini coefficient for years of schooling in different parts of the world is coming down. Inequality in years of schooling is declining all across the world. There's still differences. There's still inequality there. And the years of schooling that people get in sub-Saharan Africa isn't the same as at Simon Fraser. I mean, this is only one measure of inequality in this. But the tendencies have been going generally here in the right direction rather than the wrong direction. And yeah, you can see the same thing with regions. inequality in years of schooling for adults has been declining over time with the explosion of education. And education matters terribly to people's productive potential in life. I mean, you all here at the university know that. It can even be shown with World Bank data, that if you look at the number of years of schooling for working age women, and you plot that against the country's per capita income level, each additional year of female schooling tracks with a per capita increase, an increase in per capita income of about, not quite 40%, close to that. I mean, it's extraordinarily transformative. So the explosion of education is connected to the explosion of health, is connected to the explosion of wealth. So where does this leave us in looking towards the future? You've already had two renowned a demographic biologist and a demographer come here and talk about the demographics of our species. I'm not aware of any method that can reliably project, much less predict, future human numbers, just because we have no method of reliably predicting or forecasting human fertility into the future. But here's what we've seen. The tempo of population growth is declining. That's not the same as absolute human numbers, although those have also peaked. And the reason that the pace of our species growth has been slowing is because the number of births per woman per lifetime, the total fertility rate, has undergone a really radical, unprecedented transformation on a worldwide basis. The number of births per woman per lifetime has dropped by about half since the 1950s. And since you'll appreciate that rich countries only account for a very small fraction of the human population these days, this means that most of this action has been occurring in developing societies, in low-income societies. So what's been going on exactly? There have been a couple of generations of social science work trying to understand and predict the fertility change for localities, countries in the world. And there are all sorts of work done on correlates and determinants. That's what's called correlates and determinants of fertility change. And there have been, I can't count how many pet theories I've heard in my life about this. I mean, urbanization, education, income, nutrition, contraception, and all of these are perfectly plausible. I mean, obviously these have some influence on the fertility outlook or the sorts of childbearing patterns that different societies have. But you'll see that some of these are a little bit sloppy correlations. So for instance, look at female literacy. I mean, this is one that is often discussed. And female literacy is a good thing in its own right. It wins on its own merits without saying that it's a form of birth control. And, but you'll see that it's not a real tight line here. I mean, illiteracy tracks with about 3/5 of the changes in fertility that you see in the world in this kind of like shotgun blast here. I mean, there's some, but not hardly perfect. Same sort of thing if you look at modern contraceptive prevalence for women of childbearing ages. Yeah, it's about not quite 60% of the change gets tracked with that. Income, sure. I mean, you think that richer societies have smaller families, so, so that ought to be good as a predictor. And yeah, it's about 3/5. Now I'm going to show you something that actually is a very good predictor of family size around the world. You see, it's a little bit better, isn't it? It's like, this tracks with like about 90% of the variance. My favorite little predictor here. It's what women say they want. What family size do you want? And you'd be very surprised. What people want actually sometimes has an impact on outcomes of things like family size choices. I wonder why. So, I mean, this of course begs the question of why people want larger or smaller families, but it's an awfully good predictor. I mean, in the world of social science, this is an awfully good predictor of human behavior, and it's interesting because it's been strangely neglected in an awful lot of the discussions about family planning and population growth and so forth. But reintroducing this whole question of human volition is probably a good thing. I'll show you one. This is the last one that I have here. There are people who say, and there are actually a lot of people in the population area who say, that if we had more modern contraception, we'd have smaller families around the world, because they see this as an efficiency question. Without modern contraception, people can't reach their desired family sizes, and there'll be a lot of excess births in places that don't have efficient modern contraception. The argument sounds plausible, but when you look at kind of empirical evidence, it's kind of harder to see where the argument actually is. What I've done here is I've shown the reported percentage of contraceptive prevalence, of use of modern contraceptives by women of childbearing ages as reported in demographic and health surveys, after the year 2000, in the more or less the last decade, against the gap between what people say they want in terms of family size and the actual fertility level in these places. And what people say in some societies is lower than what's actually happening, and in some places it's higher. But on the whole, knowing what the contraceptive prevalence level is in a country can tell you nothing. It tells you absolutely nothing about whether that country is going to have more or less so-called excess fertility. So, here endeth the sermon. What I hope I've showed is that the extraordinary changes in human numbers can be understood in economic ways. It's not a Malthusian economic story that I've described for you, although it is a very human economic story. It makes a lot of sense if you think that human beings have some control over their immediate environments and try to maximize their well-being under certain uncertainties and constraints. This does not, I have talked not at all about our environmental problems. I've talked not at all about about some of our major ecological problems. Just simply about the question of living standards for this exploding population that we all are part of. I'm very happy to discuss any or all of this with you as you see fit now. So thank you very much.